Hello and welcome to Scale Stuff. In this week's video I'm going to be building and reviewing the Airfix 176 scale Sherman Crab. One of Hobart's funnies, these ingenious little tanks use a rotating flail to clear minefields during World War II. I've been after making one of these tanks for a while, but the crap flail in this kit put me off building it for ages, but I think that now I've worked out how I'm going to go about fixing that. In the box you get a black and white instruction sheet and paint guide, the parts to build the mine flail, an old set of silver rubber band tracks, the parts to build the tank, and a small sheet of decals to mark up a tank from the 79th Armoured Division. A first quick look at the sprues shows that the tank part of this kit is a classic vintage classic. Flash, numbers and ejection marks can all be found on this part of the model. I have already built this part of the kit before for the LCM landing craft. Strangely though, even though that kit was more modern, the flash on this older one doesn't seem as bad. These sprues date back to 1961 and they look their age. This box labels the tank as 1/72nd scale. This is an error, as this kit's been released multiple times under the 1/76 scale. The flail part of the kit looks a fair bit crisper than its box buddy, but there is still a small amount of cleanup that will need to be done on these parts. The flail part of this kit dates back to 2005, when Airfix started adding things to their older lineup to try and freshen them up a bit. Anyway, onto the build. First thing on the menu is the wheels. Off screen I've pre-cleaned up these parts as there was a fair bit of flash. Also some of the wheel axle holes had not cast, but these bits were fairly simple things to clean up. Building the wheels is fiddly, but easy enough to get done. I found it easier to add the wheels to the axles before adding glue, as it cuts down on the opportunity for mess. Next up it's time to make the sides of the tank. While cleaning up these bits for this upcoming step, I remembered what the drive wheels are like in this model. Possibly the worst in any kit I've seen. I say that fondly though. But as you can see, one of the teeth is an attachment point. It's no fuss to just cut the tooth shape out from where it's attached, but yeah, shouldn't really be a step you need to do. Now it's time to add the wheels to the sides of the tank. The wheels go on easily, but some bits need a little squeeze to get them into place. Pay attention to the upper rollers. The small roller bit points up. Also, these parts come in left and right side versions, so if it doesn't look right, it probably isn't. When it came time to add the drive wheel to the side, I opted not to glue this part in, as hopefully it will make fitting the rubber band tracks easier later on. This is how one completed side's looking. I'm going to go and build the other side now off screen, as no one needs to see the same step twice. Sides done, it's now time to build the main lower hull. The fit here is very floaty and delicate. The parts do go into place though, albeit with a little bit of backwards and forwards. I remember the last time I built an Airfix Sherman, I found this step a lot harder than I did this time round. I think I've gotten used to the vintage classic lineup's way of doing things. Lower hull completed, this is what it's looking like. I'm now going to leave this to dry for a bit so it's safer to handle later on. While that's drying, it's on to building the turret. The turret's a simple but fiddly build stage. I wasn't sure which way to put the barrel on, so I put it on in the way I thought looked best. The turret hatches were the worst bit of this stage. It's a right fiddle to add them. With those bits on though, that completes the turret stage of the build. Lastly, it's time to add some details to the hull. At this stage, the instructions also want me to add the tracks, but I'll do that later. These last bits are nice and simple to add. With those bits on and the turret attached, that concludes the tank stage of this build. Now it's on to building the flail. The flail goes together okay, but it's a bit fiddly to line up all of the 6 sides. Just make sure to alternate the flail parts, as I forgot to do this while filming and had to take this apart and reassemble it. Other than that though, the only problem I have with the flail is I hate the look of the mid-swing snapshot chains. I'm going to add my own chains, but before I can do that, I'm going to need to leave this bit to dry for a good while. For anyone who's going to build this as it is out of the box, this is how the flail part should look completed. Just make sure to remove the feed ports in between the chains. I've not bothered because I'm just going to cut them all off in a bit. But yeah, with the flail dry, I cut off all the chain arms and start drilling. This is going to take an age, so I'm going to do the rest of these holes off screen. With the holes drilled, it's time to get the chain sorted. For this, I've got the cheapest, thinnest bit of tack chain I could find. You know it's rubbish when you can pull it apart with your bare hands. For a small flail change though, it's perfect, if maybe a little bit thick still if you're after perfection scale wise. I'm cutting the chain down into short lengths about the same size as the plastic ones I've cut off. I'm not worried about them being exact, as it's more the effect I'm going for, and in real life these chains had a life expectancy and would get destroyed during use. With all the links cut, I'm adding them to the centre drum. For this I'm using super glue. This is quite a lot of self-inflicted work. I just hope it takes the paint well at the end. But the more chains I add, the more I'm liking the look of this. This is the finished flail bit. Can't wait to see how this looks when it's done. Now it's time to start making the mount for the flail. The left and right sides for this are mislabeled and the wrong way round, but they won't fit if you try and put them on backwards though, so don't worry about that. Building this bit is very floaty. It clicks into place, but there's no real stability. The top square brace doesn't seem to fit on first glance. However, the gaps between the sides and this part are needed to attach it to the tank later on. Carrying on with the frame, thankfully adding this brace makes things a bit more solid. Adding the other bits though is much the same as before, not the greatest of fits, and a little bit unstable. These stages will all benefit from a good bit of drying time in between adding the parts. Finally, with everything dry, I'm adding the flail arm to the tank. I was dreading this, but this stage actually went on really nice. Despite the small surface area that it's attached to, the flail actually goes on quite solid. With the flail on, that completes the build stage of this model. This is what it's looking like so far. It's got more gold chains than Mr. T. I found because of the extra bling at the front, I needed to add some fishing weight to the hull to keep the rear wheels down. Now it's onto the painting. For this I'm using Humbrol 155 olive drab spray paint. As always, I'm painting this up off screen outside to avoid fumigating myself. This is how it's looking with the base coat down. Now it's on to painting all the black things on the tank. For this I'm using Vallejo matte black. Painting the wheels is tricky with all the stuff in the way, but it's not impossible. Painting the flail chains though took a small eternity to do. Tons of angles to get into, and some of the chains are still flexible, making getting around them really tough. Thankfully, I get the paint down without making too much of a mess. Now it's time to paint the tall handles up with Army Painter Leather Brown. I also touch up a few of the metal bits in black while I've still got the finer brush out. With the smaller details done, it's time to give the tank its first wash. For this I'm using watered down Vallejo matte black. I'm not sure what order the videos have been released in, but it's really nice to be using a wash over Humbrol spray paint again. This spray paint takes a wash well, and I find it sort of soaks up the paint. Anyway, enough shilling for Humbrol. The tank really needed a wash, and it's starting to look less like a toy now. With the wash dry, next it's time to add the decals. The decals in this older Airfix model are really nice. They're more matte than the newer kit decals and a lot thinner. This makes them quite delicate though compared to the newer releases, so if you're building one of these older versions, be sure to watch out for that. Like with a lot of these simple decals, they really do a great job of bringing the kit to life. Next it's time for the tank's dust coat. For this first dust coat, I'm hitting this with my tried and tested Army Painter Skellington Bone. On this tank, I'm trying to do the dry brush lighter than I would do normally, as I think I've overdone it in some of my previous builds, and I want a more subtle effect on this one. With the first dust coat on, I'm going for my second dust coat, applied even lighter than the first. For this, I'm using Army Painter Elf Green. With this coat, I apply it more up and down to give the paint a grimy, subtle, streaky effect. While the dust coats are drying, I move on to paint the tracks. Off screen I've mounted the tracks together using a scalpel blade heated up, and I've also given them a base coat of matte black. On the first pass I dry brush the tracks with Army Painter Gunmetal. While I have this colour on the brush, I give the chains a light dry brush with this. I don't want to overdo it here, as the chains that I've seen on the real Sherman Crabs have all been painted black, but that might be a museum thing to preserve them, as otherwise you just end up with rust everywhere. Now I paint the rubber pads back with matte black. Finally, I dry brush the track edges with Army Painter Leather Brown, as Sherman tracks always seem to rust up around the ends. Next it's time to add the tracks. Getting the tracks behind the flail mechanism is the hardest bit of this step. The guide teeth on the drive wheels need to contain the tracks, and yeah, if you have the tracks over them, they won't fit right. With the tracks on, I secure them with a few drops of super glue. This is how it's looking with the tracks on. Now, a little thing I like to do with my models while the tracks dry, not sure why I haven't shown this before, is I take the turret off and stack some paint pots on the model while it dries, just to make sure it dries nice and flat without any bumpy bits in the tracks. We're on the final run now. Now it's time to give the tank its mud coat. For this I'm using BS Dark Earth. As this is a flail tank, I want to give the area around the front of the tank a good hit with this, as the flail would throw stuff everywhere. Add that to the fact that every now and again one would hit a mine, and yeah, you're going to have a very muddy front of a tank. After adding just BS Dark Earth, I decided that it wasn't muddy enough, so I mixed up some MIG wet mud with fine sand and dabbed this texture paint on and around the front of the tank and the rear of the turret, as when the flail on these tanks was running, they were only run with the turret facing backwards, so the back of the turret would have actually got more mud on it than the front. After doing this, I thought I might have overdone it a little bit, so to blend it back down, I went over this mud coat again with a light dab of BS Dark Earth mixed with a bit of sand just to keep in with the texture. Anyway, with that on, I think I'm going to call this model finished. This is the finished model kit. I really like how this kit's turned out. It's nice to have another one of Hobart's funnies in the display cabinet. I think a carpet layer and a duplex drive's going on the future builds list now. In conclusion, the Airfix 1/76 scale Sherman Crab is an okay model kit that with a bit of gentle persuasion builds into a very nice model. The old Sherman part of this kit is a bit dated. I'm sure there are many finer examples out there of this subject matter, but the kit is still functional, even with some of its old 60s charm. The flail part of this kit is a bit of a fiddle to build, but not massively frustrating. A big part of this part's problem, I think, is just the nature of the subject matter. Two free floating arms that need to go on a spiky drum are always going to present a few problems. I didn't like the stock flail on this model though, as I think those straight chains look really cheap and nasty. If the flails got to be running, I think it would look better with them bent backwards slightly like they just hit the ground, and that's coming from someone who spent literally days looking at a strimmer end at work. I think the big plus of this kit is the price. I picked up this kit for around £8 second hand, and I've seen them go for between £6 and £14 online. And at this price range, I think the model is well worth the money, as though it's not the most accurate of models or the newest, it's easily half the price of other models representing this rather niche tank. Anyway, that's my build and review of the Airfix 176 scale Sherman Crab. As always, thank you for watching. If you made it this far, please consider subscribing, as it really helps the channel out. Until next time though, look after yourselves and have a good one. Goodbye.